1942 – The Libyan Desert. Heat shimmered across the sand as a British reconnaissance patrol crested a low ridge. Through binoculars, the crew spotted movement, German armored vehicles advancing in loose formation, dust plumes trailing behind them. In most armored cars of the era, this sight triggered only one response: withdraw immediately. Reconnaissance doctrine was clear. Observe. Report. Avoid contact. Survive. But this crew did something different. They turned toward the enemy. The driver steadied the vehicle. The gunner laid the sights. A 40mm round slammed into a German half-track at nearly 400 yards. The vehicle erupted in flames. Before the enemy could react, the British car reversed smoothly into cover, repositioned, and fired again. This was not how armored car warfare was supposed to work. Across Europe, reconnaissance vehicles were considered the eyes of the army, not its fists. They were meant to gather information, not win fights. Engagement with enemy armor was considered failure, not success. But in North Africa, doctrine collided brutally with reality. British reconnaissance units in the early years of the Second World War faced a simple, deadly truth. They were outgunned. The Marmon Harrington carried the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a weapon already obsolete by 1941. The Humber mounted a 15mm Baser machine gun. The Morris combined a Boy's rifle with a Bren gun. On paper, these weapons could damage enemy vehicles. In practice, they rarely did. The Boy's rifle was heavy, inaccurate, and punishing to fire. Crews dreaded using it. Its recoil bruised shoulders and fractured confidence. Against German armored cars or half-tracks at real combat ranges, it was little more than a gesture of defiance. The 15mm Baser was better, but still marginal. It could threaten lightly armored vehicles, but struggled against anything with serious protection. Worse still, German reconnaissance vehicles increasingly mounted 20mm autocannons, fast-firing weapons that shredded British cars with ease. The exchange was lethally unequal. British patrols found themselves hunted by enemy scouts they could neither outrun nor outfight. Encounters became death traps. Reconnaissance missions, once routine, turned into suicide assignments. And the problem wasn't only technical. It was psychological. Commanders struggled to find volunteers for forward patrols. Soldiers knew the odds. They were being asked to scout an enemy they could not fight, in vehicles that could not protect them. Morale collapsed. Intelligence quality suffered. Reconnaissance, the very foundation of mobile warfare, began to fail. Something had to change. The British Army needed a reconnaissance vehicle that could fight back. Not to replace tanks, but to give scouts a choice. A way to survive contact. A way to punish enemy reconnaissance instead of fleeing from it. But that requirement seemed impossible. An armored car needed to be fast enough to scout, light enough to maneuver, and powerful enough to destroy enemy vehicles. Conventional wisdom insisted you could only have two of those qualities, never all three. Tanks carried heavy guns and armor, but sacrificed speed. Scout cars prioritized mobility but gave up firepower. Engineers across Europe had tried to bridge the gap, and failed. The Americans armed their M8 Greyhound with a 37mm gun, but gave it minimal armor. It was fast, yes, but dangerously vulnerable. The Germans built impressive 8-wheeled armored cars, but restricted them to observation roles. Their doctrine demanded caution, not combat. No one believed you could mount a proper anti-tank gun on a wheeled vehicle and make it work. The recoil alone would tear the chassis apart. The weight would cripple mobility. Ammunition storage would consume all available space. The idea was dismissed as impractical, if not outright foolish. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, better known as BSA, was famous for motorcycles, bicycles, and small arms. In 1938, it had won a contract to produce a tiny two-man scout vehicle known as the Daimler Dingo. The Dingo was fast, low, and agile, but lightly armed and purely observational. But BSA's chief designer, Sidney L. Sheldon, saw something more. What if reconnaissance didn't have to be helpless? What if scouts had a real gun, not a machine gun, not an autocannon, but a true anti-tank weapon? Something capable of destroying enemy armored cars and half-tracks decisively. In April 1939, Sheldon's team began work on a radical concept. Internally, they called it the light tank wheeled. The name captured the ambition perfectly. This would not be an armored car pretending to have firepower. It would be a tank, with wheels. The gun choice made that intent unmistakable. BSA selected the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a 40mm anti-tank gun already in service with British tanks like the Crusader and Valentine. This was no compromise weapon. The 2-pounder fired armor-piercing rounds at nearly 800 meters per second, enough to defeat any German armored car and most early Panzer models at combat ranges. No reconnaissance vehicle in the world carried anything comparable. To house the gun, BSA borrowed directly from tank design. The turret came from the light tank Mk7 Tetrarch, giving the vehicle firepower equivalent to British tanks 3 times its weight. Secondary armament consisted of a coaxial 7.92mm Baser machine gun, fed by thousands of rounds. There were trade-offs. The 2-pounder lacked an effective high-explosive shell for much of its service. It was excellent against armor, but poor against infantry positions, gun emplacements, or buildings. This was a weapon optimized for killing vehicles, not supporting troops. For reconnaissance work, that made sense. The greatest threat to scouts wasn't infantry, it was enemy armored reconnaissance. And against that threat, the new vehicle would be devastating. Making the concept work, however, required revolutionary engineering. The vehicle would weigh nearly 7.5 tons, almost twice the weight of the Dingo. That mass placed enormous strain on the drivetrain. Conventional transmissions would fail. Recoil forces had to be absorbed without destroying the chassis. Mobility had to be preserved despite the weight. Sheldon's solution was brilliant. He combined a Wilson pre-selector gearbox with a fluid flywheel. The driver could pre-select the next gear and engage it instantly with a tap of a pedal. The fluid coupling prevented engine stall, even under combat stress. Most remarkably, the vehicle had 5 forward gears and 5 reverse gears, all offering identical performance. A Daimler could charge an enemy, fire, then reverse away at full speed, without turning around. The gun stayed pointed at the threat the entire time. This single feature transformed reconnaissance tactics. Add to that an H-drive system sending power to all 4 wheels, independent suspension, hydraulic disc brakes, cutting-edge technology for 1941, and the result defied expectations. Against all odds, the impossible balance had been achieved. Speed, firepower, mobility. By the time production began in 1941, Britain had quietly built the world's most heavily armed reconnaissance vehicle. And soon, it would meet the enemy. The Daimler armored car did not enter service quietly. From the moment it reached frontline units, it began rewriting the rules of reconnaissance warfare. In early 1942, the 11th Hussars, veterans of desert scouting since the opening days of the war, received their first Daimlers in North Africa. These men knew better than anyone what reconnaissance usually meant: fast driving, constant evasion, and the ever-present knowledge that if contact was made with enemy armor, survival depended on escape rather than resistance. The Daimler changed that equation overnight. Where earlier patrols had avoided German vehicles at all costs, Daimler crews began actively engaging them. German half-tracks, armored cars, and light vehicles that once dominated reconnaissance encounters suddenly found themselves outmatched. The 2-pounder gun could destroy an SD KFZ 222 or SD KFZ 231 at any realistic combat range. The German 20mm autocannon, by contrast, struggled to penetrate the Daimler's 14mm frontal armor, especially at distance. For the first time, British reconnaissance crews had a vehicle that was not merely adequate, but superior. The effect was immediate and profound. Patrols no longer fled at first contact. They maneuvered. They baited. They ambushed. The Daimler's unique ability to reverse at full speed allowed crews to engage briefly, then disengage before the enemy could respond effectively. German scouts accustomed to bullying British patrols suddenly found themselves hunted. One contemporary account noted that Daimler crews finally felt on equal or better terms with their opponents. That shift mattered enormously. Intelligence gathering improved. Patrols pushed deeper. Contact reports became more detailed. Reconnaissance was no longer timid. It was aggressive. During operations around Gazala, El Alamein, and the long pursuit across Libya, Daimler screened British advances while denying the same freedom to German reconnaissance units. They destroyed half-tracks, knocked out command vehicles, and disrupted enemy observation long before main forces arrived. An Imperial War Museum photograph from January 1943 captures a Daimler firing into the half-light of dawn during the opening stages of the drive on Tripoli. The image is grainy, the vehicle half obscured by dust, but the message is unmistakable. This was reconnaissance that fought. As the campaign moved from desert to mountains, the Daimler proved its adaptability. In Italy, terrain replaced distance as the primary challenge. Narrow roads, steep gradients, and broken infrastructure limited mobility. Yet the Daimler's compact size, exceptional climbing ability, and precise handling allowed it to operate where heavier vehicles struggled. The 11th Hussars landed at Salerno in September 1943 and fought through Naples, the Volturno crossings, and northward up the peninsula. In some mountainous areas, reconnaissance units even formed improvised horse troops, terrain so restrictive that nothing on wheels could pass. Where vehicles could operate, the Daimler remained invaluable. Its ability to fight from ambush positions, firing, reversing instantly, then repositioning, proved ideal for Italy's broken ground. During fighting around Monte Cassino, the Liri Valley, and the Argenta Gap, Daimler crews repeatedly demonstrated that a well-handled armored car could dominate far more powerful enemies through positioning and speed. By 1944, the Daimler had already earned a reputation as one of the most effective reconnaissance vehicles of the war. Then came Normandy. On June 6, 1944, Daimlers of C Squadron, Inns of Court Regiment landed on Juno Beach with the 3rd Canadian Division. Their orders were ambitious and dangerous. Push inland immediately, identify enemy defenses, and secure or destroy bridges before German reserves could react. The reality was chaos. Mines littered the beaches. 88mm guns covered exits. Traffic jams formed under fire. Several Daimlers were knocked out within hours of landing. Crews took casualties almost immediately. Yet despite losses, the regiment pushed inland. Normandy presented challenges unlike anything faced in North Africa. The bocage, dense hedgerows packed with earth and roots, limited visibility to a few yards and funneled vehicles into predictable lanes. For reconnaissance units, this was a nightmare. The Inns of Court Regiment adapted. They created improvised SOD vehicles, Daimlers with their turrets removed entirely. These low-profile command cars could navigate narrow lanes without advertising their presence. It was an unofficial modification, born of necessity, and it worked. The fact that the Daimler chassis could accept such adaptation without loss of mobility spoke volumes about its design. What began as a desert reconnaissance vehicle proved just as effective in close, cluttered European terrain. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and surged across France, the Daimler came into its own. In September 1944, during the rapid advance into Belgium, Lieutenant Roger Duendre of the 1st Belgian Armoured Car Squadron drove his Daimler Mk2, named Calamity, into Brussels. He became the first Allied armoured vehicle to enter the liberated capital. The moment symbolized everything the Daimler represented: speed, initiative, and aggressive reconnaissance. Belgian civilians overwhelmed the vehicles, celebrating liberation after 4 years of occupation. The Belgian squadron would continue fighting in Daimlers through the Netherlands and into Germany. Operation Market Garden presented one of the Daimler's most demanding tests. As XXX Corps attempted to race north toward Arnhem, reconnaissance became critical. Roads were narrow, flanked by marshland and enemy positions. German defenses were stronger than anticipated. Progress was constantly threatened by ambush. Daimlers of the 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment scouted relentlessly ahead of the column, probing for gaps, identifying threats, and navigating routes that heavier vehicles could not risk. On the 22nd of September, 1944, Household Cavalry Daimlers finally linked up with Polish paratroopers near Driel, maneuvering around German positions that would have stopped less capable vehicles cold. Though Market Garden ultimately failed, the reconnaissance performed by Daimler-equipped units represented the best that could be achieved under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Comparison with enemy vehicles highlights why the Daimler succeeded. The standard German reconnaissance car, the SD KFZ 222, mounted a 20mm autocannon. Effective against light targets, it struggled against better protected vehicles. Its open-top turret left crews vulnerable to artillery fragments, grenades, and weather. The Daimler's enclosed turret protected its crew. Its 2-pounder outranged and overmatched German scout cars. In most direct encounters, the British vehicle held the advantage. The SD KFZ 234-2 Puma was a different matter. With its 50mm gun, thicker armor, and 8-wheel drive, it was arguably superior on paper. Post-war analysts often ranked it as the finest armored car of the war. But only 101 Pumas were ever built. The British produced 2,694 Daimlers. Doctrine also mattered. German reconnaissance emphasized avoidance of decisive engagement. Even excellent equipment mattered less when doctrine discouraged aggressive use. The British, by contrast, actively encouraged Daimler crews to exploit their vehicle strengths. The American M8 Greyhound offers another revealing contrast. Over 12,000 were built, prioritizing mass production. Its 37mm gun was respectable, but its floor armor measured just 3 to 6 mm, catastrophically vulnerable to mines. British crews operating M8s famously lined the floors with sandbags for protection. When given a choice, British units consistently preferred the Daimler. Better protection. Better cross-country mobility. Better survivability. By 1944, the Daimler was no longer just a reconnaissance vehicle. It was a proven combat platform, one that had reshaped how reconnaissance was conducted across multiple theaters of war. And it still wasn't done evolving. By 1944, the Daimler armored car had already earned its place in history. It had fought in deserts, mountains, hedgerows, and cities. It had proven that reconnaissance vehicles did not have to flee at first contact. But the battlefield was changing. German armor was getting heavier. The 2-pounder gun that once overmatched enemy scouts now faced tougher opponents. British engineers responded not by redesigning the vehicle, but by improving the weapon it already carried. The result was one of the most ingenious upgrades of the war, the Little John adapter. The Little John was a squeeze-bore attachment fitted to the muzzle of the 2-pounder. Named after its Czech inventor, František Janeček, anglicized to Little John, the device worked by gradually reducing the bore diameter as the projectile exited the barrel. Special tungsten cord ammunition compressed as it passed through the adapter, dramatically increasing muzzle velocity and penetration. The improvement was substantial. With the Little John fitted, the Daimler's 2-pounder could penetrate armor previously beyond its capability. In Northwest Europe, this meant that Daimler crews could threaten not just enemy reconnaissance vehicles, but also heavier German armor under favorable conditions. There were limitations. Tungsten was scarce, and ammunition supply was restricted. The special rounds were incompatible with high explosive shells, eliminating the weapon's already limited anti-infantry capability. Crews had to choose their loadouts carefully. But the key point was this. A vehicle designed in 1939 could still be meaningfully upgraded in 1944 without modification to its chassis, turret, or suspension. The platform was fundamentally sound. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, Daimlers continued to operate at the sharp edge of reconnaissance. In the final weeks of the war, units equipped with Daimlers screened advances, identified collapsing enemy positions, and exploited gaps in German defenses. On May 3, 1945, the 11th Hussars, the same regiment that had first proven the Daimler in the North African desert, led the 7th Armored Division into Hamburg. The vehicle that had earned its reputation under the sun of Libya now rolled into the heart of the Reich. Between those 2 points lay an extraordinary combat record. Daimler armored cars had served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. No other British armored car could claim such comprehensive service across so many major campaigns. Yet the Daimler story did not end in 1945. In the immediate post-war years, many wartime vehicles were scrapped or relegated to secondary roles. The Daimler, by contrast, remained in frontline service. The British Army retained it well into the Cold War, finally withdrawing the last examples in January 1960, when B Squadron 11th Hussars retired their vehicles in Northern Ireland. Attempts to replace it were surprisingly unsuccessful. In the late 1940s, Britain developed the Coventry armoured car as a supposed successor. On paper, it was newer, more modern, and intended to supersede the Daimler entirely. In practice, testing revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Daimler was better. It offered superior mobility, reliability, and overall effectiveness. The Coventry's production was halted after just 220 vehicles. The replacement failed. The original endured. International service extended the Daimler's life even further. India operated Daimlers with the 63rd Cavalry and the President's Bodyguard, finding them well suited to rugged terrain. During the 1962 Sino-Indian War, Daimlers were deployed in mountainous regions along the Himalayan frontier, terrain utterly unlike anything their designers had envisioned in 1939. They performed well. Malaysia used Daimlers extensively during the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960. Jungle tracks, poor roads, and long patrols favored vehicles that combined mobility with real firepower. The Daimler's ability to traverse difficult ground while still engaging insurgent positions made it a valuable asset. Sri Lanka received 12 Daimlers in 1959 and retained them through the 1971 insurrection and beyond. Remarkably, some were reportedly kept operational into the late 1990s, nearly 50 years after the vehicle's introduction. Few armored vehicles of any era can claim such longevity. The Daimler's engineering legacy lived on even after its retirement. The Ferret armored car, which replaced it in British service, inherited key features: the H-drive transmission, pre-selector gearbox, compact silhouette, and emphasis on reconnaissance mobility. Sidney Sheldon's design philosophy shaped an entire generation of British armored vehicles. So why did the Daimler succeed where others failed? The answer lies not just in engineering, but in philosophy. Other nations asked, how do we build the best scout car? The British asked, how do we give reconnaissance crews a chance to fight when they must? That distinction mattered. Reconnaissance doctrine across Europe emphasized avoidance of decisive engagement. Scouts were to observe, report, and withdraw. The Daimler did not reject that doctrine, but it refused to be bound by its limitations. It gave crews options. A British reconnaissance trooper in 1942 could engage enemy armor at 400 yards with a realistic expectation of destroying it. He could fight, disengage, and survive. That capability transformed behavior. Patrols became bolder. Intelligence became richer. Enemy reconnaissance became cautious. The Daimler did not turn reconnaissance units into tank hunters. It simply ensured they were no longer helpless. Production numbers underline its impact. 2,694 vehicles built. Service on every major British front. Continued use by Allied nations for decades after the war. And today, only 41 known survivors remain, testament to how hard these vehicles were worked and how rarely they were spared. The Daimler armored car was sometimes described as a strange British solution. A reconnaissance vehicle armed like a tank. A scout that could fight. In reality, it was not strange at all. It was the logical answer to a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. British engineers refused to believe that reconnaissance had to be passive. They challenged doctrine, accepted risk, and built a vehicle that gave crews a choice when circumstances demanded more than observation. That choice, speed or firepower, withdrawal or engagement, made all the difference. And that is why the Daimler armored car remains one of the most successful reconnaissance vehicles ever built.